Today I will review Boys Will Be Boys by Clementine Ford. Subtitle: Power, Patriarchy and the Toxic Bonds of Mateship. As you can probably glean from the title, this is a feminist book about how men oppress women, but also how the oppressive structures against women are harmful to men too. Now, there were a few questions at the back of my mind while I was reading this, which were: is the book accessible to a wider audience? Does she explain how to fix the problems she identifies? And would the book succeed in changing anyone's mind? And in answering those questions, I hope to reach a verdict about the book and decide how much it helps her cause. Is the book accessible to a wider audience? No. It doesn't talk to a wider, non-feminist audience. It doesn't give you a hand and explain the meanings of things like patriarchy. It mostly doesn't explain why the things it opposes are wrong. Ford expects you to agree with her, and she doesn't address counter-arguments. I'll give examples of that in a bit. Now, the fact that it isn't accessible to a wider audience isn't in itself a bad thing. Not everything has to be for everyone. For example, I wouldn't expect a physics thesis to be dumbed down for a layperson. But then the question becomes, what does it provide for her followers? And my answer is not enough. The reason why is that she doesn't engage with her opposition. She asserts that her opposition stands as ridiculous, as if it's self-evident, which doesn't provide anything by way of substantive refutation. Just to be clear, I'm not saying the book has to be written for her opposition. What I am saying is that she's not equipping her followers with enough to tackle their likely adversaries. For example, she gives an anecdote on page 32 of how a boy who wanted his face painted with a butterfly was discouraged by his parents, who called that gay and wanted him to get something more masculine. So they made him get a skull and crossbones painting. And Ford's comment on that was, "When I read stories about little boys who have their softness and love shamed out of them by parents who are enthralled to their own fear, my heart breaks. This is why it's so important to break down rigid learning around what gender is and isn't supposed to be." Nothing in that passage would help you convince those parents that they did something wrong. They probably thought they were doing the right thing, raising their son to be masculine. Similarly, when she gives her account of why gender stereotyping is wrong, she doesn't address counter-arguments. So while most people might be convinced when she calls gender stereotyping bad for making trans folk anxious and depressed, other people would respond that it doesn't matter, because trans folk are statistically insignificant and incurably mentally ill. Instead of giving ways to rebut those distasteful and incorrect views, Ford dismisses them. And that persistent unwillingness to engage with the less enlightened means she isn't making a difference in the real world. Does she explain how to fix the problems she identifies? Yes. As an example, on page 67 she proposes that we adopt the Swedish model of paid paternity leave to tackle gender stereotyping. She says this cultivates a more empathic version of masculinity that positively affects children and society as a whole. While I am inclined to think this is a good model, I'm not sure that taking measures like these really addresses what upsets Ford. Take her observation on page 28 that from the age of 6 onwards, children were more likely to assume natural intelligence and superiority in men rather than in women. I can't really see how dads with longer paternity leave would correct this bias. I mean, for all we know, it might make the bias worse. We're in the dark because she hasn't referenced any data about the model, and again she fails to address counter-arguments. So while solutions are offered, the evidence is not. Would the book succeed in changing anyone's mind? Assuming people without feminist sympathies in the first place even would read it, my answer is that it might, because some of it is persuasive. But there is a flaw in this book that a lot of potential converts wouldn't be able to see past. I'm referring to her misandry. Misandry meaning hatred of men. I'll just read out some of it, explain why she might be doing it, and then I'll comment on it. Page 118. For good measure, I then tweeted the succinct catch cry of the angry feminist #CancelMen. Whoops, someone with as much experience as I have in the field of crushingly fragile male egos should have known that by doing this I broke accepted protocol. You're not supposed to punctuate the rage you feel about men's violence with sarcastic references to ridding the world of the male scourge. So my charitable view is that this misandry is a form of social commentary. She's highlighting how men get really sensitive over the same kinds of things women put up with daily. It's meant to make men empathize. It's meant to make them go, oh, so this is how misogyny feels. I kind of get it, but on the other hand, I'm not a fan of it. I find it unnecessarily polarizing. I mean, imagine if I started talking about ridding the world of the female scourge. If you were a woman, I likely wouldn't win you over to my side. So, if your goal is to convince, you should be careful making those jokes, because while those jokes can be funny, they can also be divisive. Ford actually addresses this complaint of mine under a heading called "You Lose Credibility with Your Misandry" on page 117. So she makes two rebuttals, and her first is that misandry isn't real. Because it doesn't pose a systemic threat to men, because it doesn't contribute to male oppression, that means it's okay to say mean things about men. First, that's like saying it's okay to point an unloaded gun at someone. No, it isn't okay. And second, whether misandry is an actual threat to men is not in dispute. It's actually irrelevant. What is in dispute is whether you should stoop to the misogynist's level just because you can. And in my opinion, no, you shouldn't, unless you want the feminist movement to look stupid. Her second rebuttal is that men who say this are not real feminists, because their support is conditional. She says they claim to be supportive of the feminist cause of equality, but only on the condition that she's nice to them. The first thing here is she's attacking a straw man. I have never heard any man say this before, and no example is given. What people are actually saying is that misandry hurts her cause, an argument she doesn't ever address. The second thing is, she's conflating the demand for not being obnoxious and being reasonable with the demand for being nice. This is sly. Complaining over misandry is not saying, be nice to me. It's saying, be reasonable. Don't stoop to the misogynist's level and push away outsiders. In a chapter called The Manosphere, Ford takes aim at online echo chambers. It's an entertaining look at what happens when weird, misogynistic beliefs are allowed to fester unchecked in online spaces. Incels, pick-up artists, red pillars, etc. Funny though it may be, in its own way this book is no better than the silly echo chambers she investigates. Her engagement with the opposition is rarely more than ridicule, and although she illuminates what women are up against, which is a useful exercise, when she confronts patriarchy, she falls back on bitterness rather than giving anyone the agency to handle it.